It all started on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, with the soft hum of jet engines filling the air and passengers bustling to settle into their seats. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, hurried announcements echoing over the PA system, the rhythmic tapping of suitcase wheels against tiled floors, and the occasional frustrated sigh of someone rushing to catch their flight. Among the crowd, a young black woman named Maya stood out, not because she tried to, but because she carried herself with an effortless grace that naturally drew attention. She was dressed simply yet elegantly, her curls framing her face like a crown, her eyes holding a quiet strength that spoke of resilience and dignity. Maya boarded the plane with a smile on her face, eager to reach her destination for an important conference she had spent months preparing for. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, juggling her carry-on and a book tucked under her arm, she noticed a man already seated in her assigned row. He was older, sharply dressed in an expensive suit, his presence commanding the kind of attention that made people instinctively step aside. His expression, however, was far less inviting. His sharp, judgmental eyes swept over her as she approached, and a flicker of disdain curled his lips. "Excuse me," Maya said politely, motioning to the window seat next to him. The man glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't move an inch, making no effort to let her pass. "Yes, 14A, Maya replied, keeping her tone steady, though the question stung. She held up her boarding pass to confirm. The man sighed dramatically, as if her presence was a personal inconvenience. Without a word, he shifted his knees slightly, the bare minimum required for her to squeeze past him. Maya maneuvered around him, trying to keep her composure, but she couldn't ignore the cold hostility radiating from him. As she settled into her seat, she could hear him muttering under his breath, just loud enough for her to catch snippets of his words. Unbelievable. Standards these days should have flown first class. Maya bit her lip, choosing not to engage, though her hands tightened around the book in her lap. She'd had faced this kind of prejudice before, and while it never got easier, she knew better than to let it ruin her day. The plane began to fill, passengers chatting and laughing as they found their seats. But the tension between Maya and the man next to her hung thick in the air, unnoticed by the others. It wasn't long before the flight attendants closed the cabin doors, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board and preparing for takeoff. Maya took a deep breath, turning to look out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, the city shrinking below them as they ascended into the clouds. But what Maya didn't realize was that this journey would be anything but ordinary, and the man sitting next to her had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget, a lesson about respect, humility, and the strength of the human spirit. As the flight progressed, his attitude only worsened. He deliberately encroached on her space, hugging the armrest and sprawling his legs into her area. When the flight attendants came by with refreshments, he sneered when Maya politely asked for water, mumbling something about freeloaders. Despite the blatant disrespect, Maya remained calm, her quiet resilience serving as a stark contrast to his arrogance. It wasn't until halfway through the flight that something unexpected happened. The man, still exuding an air of superiority, glanced behind him, and his smug expression faltered for the first time. His eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He quickly turned back, his posture stiffening. Maya noticed the change, but before she could piece it together, the pilot's voice came over the intercom with an announcement. What the man saw behind him, and what the pilot was about to say, would shift the entire atmosphere of the plane, and for Maya, it would mark a turning point in a journey she would never forget. The announcement crackled over the speakers, the pilot's voice steady, yet carrying a hint of importance. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 35,000 feet, and I'd like to take a moment to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. We're proud to have several distinguished passengers on board, including some traveling to attend the Global Leadership Summit. We'll be arriving on schedule, and in the meantime, sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight?" "Yes," she answered simply. He nodded slowly, his eyes darting nervously toward the gentleman behind him before returning to Maya. For the first time since she'd boarded the plane, there was no malice in his gaze, only a flicker of something that looked almost like regret. Whatever battle he was fighting internally, it was clear that it wasn't over yet. Maya decided to leave him to his thoughts. She returned to her book, letting the steady rhythm of the plane's engines lull her into a sense of calm. But even as she read, she couldn't shake the feeling that the story unfolding around her was far from finished. The plane hummed steadily as the passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. Maya kept her focus on her book, though the words blurred on the page. She was too aware of the man beside her, his earlier arrogance now replaced with an awkward silence. His shift in demeanor intrigued her, but she resisted the urge to speculate. Whatever had sparked his discomfort wasn't her concern, at least not yet. Behind them, the distinguished gentleman sat calmly, his presence unshakable. He hadn't said another word since praising Maya, yet his quiet confidence seemed to loom large in the confined space. The man next to Maya, who had radiated hostility just moments ago, now sat rigid, stealing occasional glances over his shoulder. Each time, he quickly snapped his head back forward, as if the mere sight of the gentleman made his unease deepen. A flight attendant paused by their row, offering beverages. Maya smiled politely and asked for a cup of tea, but the man declined, his voice tight and clipped. He barely acknowledged the attendant's presence, his gaze fixed straight ahead, like he was trying to make himself invisible. Maya couldn't help but notice how different he seemed from the person who had so openly dismissed her earlier. As she sipped her tea, Maya's thoughts drifted to the summit. The opportunity to speak was a milestone in her career, a validation of her years of hard work. Her presentation, focused on innovative ways to empower marginalized communities, wasn't just another project to her, it was her passion. She wanted to show the world that change was possible, even in the face of adversity. But now, a new thought began to creep in. Who was this man sitting next to her? And what could explain the dramatic change in his behavior? The answer wasn't far behind. A soft ding signaled the captain's voice coming through the intercom again. This time, his tone carried a sense of formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our journey, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger traveling with us today. Mr. Alan Sinclair, founder of the Sinclair Foundation, is on board. His work in fostering global education and equity has touched countless lives. We're honored to have him with us." The cabin filled with murmurs as passengers turned to catch a glimpse of the man the captain had mentioned. Maya's eyes widened slightly, and she couldn't resist a glance over her shoulder. The gentleman who had spoken to her earlier, now identified as Alan Sinclair, sat calmly, offering a humble nod to the passengers who looked his way. The name rang a bell. She had read about him while preparing for the summit. He was a philanthropist, a visionary who had dedicated his life to addressing inequality on a global scale. The man beside Maya looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His face, already pale, seemed to lose any remaining color. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. It was clear now why he had been so rattled. Alan Sinclair wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who commanded respect, someone whose presence could unmask the shallow arrogance the man had displayed earlier. Maya's curiosity deepened. What was the connection between the two? Did they know each other? Or was the man simply unnerved by the realization that someone like Alan Sinclair was seated so close? As the flight attendants moved through the aisles, another unexpected moment unfolded. A young boy, no older than 10, shyly approached Alan Sinclair, clutching a small notebook and pen. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said timidly. "My mom said you're really important. Can I have your autograph?" Alan smiled warmly, his kind eyes lighting up as he took the notebook. "Of course," he said, signing his name with a flourish. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied, beaming. "Well, Ethan, Alan said, handing back the notebook. Always remember that being kind is more important than being important. You've got a bright future ahead of you. The exchange was brief, but it left a ripple of warmth in its wake. Maya couldn't help but smile, touched by the sincerity of Alan's words. The boy returned to his seat, clutching the notebook like a treasure. But the man beside Maya shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, and his eyes darting nervously toward Alan once again. Something was eating at him, and Maya was starting to piece it together. His earlier arrogance, his discomfort at Alan's presence, and his sudden shift in behavior, it all pointed to one thing. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was afraid. The realization made Maya's heart race slightly. What was he hiding? As the plane continued to cruise through the clouds, Maya leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with possibilities. The man beside her seemed to shrink further into himself, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. Whatever connection he had to Alan Sinclair, it was clear that it was far from positive. Maya decided to let it go, at least for the moment. She returned to her book, determined to focus on her own journey. But as much as she tried to ignore it, the tension in the air was impossible to escape. The story unfolding around her was far from over, and Maya had a feeling she was about to become a part of it in ways she couldn't yet predict. The plane had settled into a steady calm, but the tension between the rows was palpable. Maya could feel it like an electric charge in the air. Alan Sinclair, now identified as a global changemaker and philanthropist, sat quietly behind them, his presence radiating an unspoken authority. The man beside her, however, seemed trapped in an invisible cage, his every movement stiff, his breathing shallow. Maya found herself glancing at him more often, trying to read the story etched across his face. As the hours ticked by, the cabin lights dimmed for the evening. Many passengers drifted into quiet conversations or watched movies on the screens in front of them. But for Maya, the flight felt anything but ordinary. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the cusp of something significant. Every detail, the man's earlier hostility, his nervous glances at Alan, the humbling realization of who was sitting behind him, felt like pieces of a puzzle just out of reach. Maya debated whether she should speak to Alan again, but something told her to wait. She didn't want to draw unnecessary attention or escalate the situation. Still, the weight of curiosity pressed heavily on her. What could possibly have caused the man beside her to crumble under the weight of Alan Sinclair's presence? And why did it feel like this moment was bigger than any of them realized? The flight attendants came through the aisle again, this time offering dinner trays. Maya accepted hers, grateful for the distraction, but the man declined, shaking his head quickly. His hands remained on his lap, fidgeting with a silver cufflink that caught the light each time he moved. She noticed a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool air circulating through the cabin. He looked like a man trapped in a storm he hadn't prepared for. Maya couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for him. As much as she resented the way he had treated her earlier, she recognized something universal in his fear, an emotion everyone has felt when faced with the consequences of their actions. Whatever he was running from, it was catching up to him, and there was nowhere to hide at 35,000 feet. As she unwrapped her utensils, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're Maya Jones, right?" Startled, Maya turned to see Alan Sinclair leaning slightly into the aisle, his kind eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she was unsure how to respond, but then she nodded. "Yes, that's me." Alan smiled warmly. "I've read about your work. The programs you've developed for underprivileged communities are groundbreaking. You're exactly the kind of voice we need at the summit." Maya felt her cheeks flush with a mix of pride and surprise. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "That means a lot coming from someone like you." Alan nodded thoughtfully but didn't say anything more. Instead, he gave her a look that seemed to convey a deeper understanding, as if he knew there was more to this moment than polite conversation. He leaned back into his seat, leaving Maya with a sense of validation she hadn't expected. The man beside her, however, sat frozen. He had heard every word of the exchange, and his reaction was unmistakable. His breathing quickened, and his hand clenched tightly around the armrest. Maya wondered if Alan's words had inadvertently struck a nerve, though she still didn't understand why. The tension finally snapped when the man spoke, his voice low and shaky. "You don't know him," he said, his words directed at Maya but barely audible. "You don't know what he's really like." Maya turned to him, startled by the sudden outburst. "Excuse me." The man shook his head, his jaw tightening. "People like him, they act like they're so noble, so perfect, but it's all for show." Maya frowned, taken aback by the bitterness in his tone. "Alan Sinclair has done a lot of good in the world. Whatever your issue is, it doesn't change that." The man's lips parted as if to argue, but he stopped himself. His eyes darted back to Alan, then forward again, as though he were weighing the consequences of speaking further. The cabin felt smaller now, the tension drawing other passengers' subtle glances in their direction. Maya held her ground, determined not to let his hostility shake her. Alan, noticing the shift, leaned forward slightly. "Is there something you'd like to say?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. He didn't sound accusatory, but the question carried an undeniable weight. The man flinched, his composure cracking even further. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his confidence. Maya could sense the man's internal struggle. It was like watching a dam threaten to burst, the pressure building with every passing moment. The plane's steady hum seemed to amplify the silence that followed, every passenger within earshot holding their breath. Alan's gaze didn't waver, and Maya found herself caught between the two men, unsure of what would happen next. Finally, the man let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You think you're better than everyone else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not." Alan's expression remained composed, though his eyes softened with a mixture of understanding and resolve. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said gently. "But I believe in holding myself accountable for my actions. Can you say the same?" The man's face flushed, and for a moment, Maya thought he might lash out. But instead, he fell silent, his gaze dropping to his lap. The energy in the cabin felt electric, every passenger now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Maya's heart raced as she waited for the next words to be spoken, knowing they would carry the weight of everything that had been building. The climax was near, and Maya realized she was no longer just an observer. She was part of this story now, whether she wanted to be or not. The silence between them grew thick, an invisible wall separating Alan Sinclair and the man who seemed to crumble under his gaze. Maya's pulse quickened, sensing that whatever was happening here was far from over. The man sat rigid, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the armrests. Alan, on the other hand, remained calm, his presence like an anchor in the storm. He didn't press further, yet his quiet confidence seemed to demand an answer without a single word spoken. Maya glanced between them, trying to make sense of the tension. She had seen power dynamics play out in boardrooms and conferences, but this was something else. There was history here, something unspoken yet undeniable. The man's earlier outburst lingered in her mind. His bitterness toward Alan wasn't just about the philanthropist's reputation. It felt personal, as though he carried a wound that had been festering for years. Then, something unexpected happened. The flight attendant approached Alan's row, carrying a discreet envelope. "Mr. Sinclair," she said softly, leaning in so only he could hear, "we've received a message for you from the ground team. It's marked urgent." Alan accepted the envelope with a nod, his expression unreadable. Maya couldn't help but notice the man beside her stiffen further, his eyes darting nervously toward the exchange. Alan opened the envelope with practiced ease, scanning the contents quickly. Whatever was written inside caused the faintest flicker of surprise to cross his features, a moment so brief that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Maya did. As Alan folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket, Maya felt an uneasy curiosity gnawing at her. The man beside her seemed to sense it too. His breathing grew shallow, and for the first time, Maya thought she saw something close to panic in his eyes. Whatever was in that envelope, it wasn't just a routine message. It was a catalyst, a signal that the simmering tension was about to boil over. The next twist came with the plane's intercom, the captain's voice cutting through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of an unexpected weather system ahead. To ensure your safety, we'll be adjusting our route and delaying our descent slightly. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your understanding." A collective groan rippled through the passengers, but Maya barely registered it. Her focus was locked on the man beside her, who had turned pale at the announcement. He was no longer fidgeting. He was completely still, as though he believed that if he didn't move, he might disappear altogether. His reaction to what should have been routine information made Maya's skin prickle with unease. Alan shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. His voice was low, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that made Maya's breath hitch. "You didn't think this would go unnoticed, did you?" he said, his words directed at the man. The man flinched, his head snapping around to face Alan. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, though his voice wavered. Alan's gaze was steady, unyielding. The summit isn't just about ideas and collaboration. It's also about accountability. And some of us don't take kindly to deception. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Deception? Accountability? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far more complex than she had imagined. The man beside her wasn't just some entitled passenger with a grudge. He was hiding something, and Alan Sinclair knew exactly what it was. The man's composure cracked further, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "This isn't the place," he hissed, his voice low and desperate. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Alan interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "And so does everyone else who's been watching you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Maya's breath caught, and she realized that other passengers had started to take notice. Eyes shifted toward their row, subtle but curious, as the tension radiated outward like a ripple in a pond. Whatever the man was hiding, it was no longer contained. The plane felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of the confrontation grew heavier. Maya felt the urge to speak, to break the suffocating silence, but she held back. This wasn't her fight, though she couldn't deny that she was deeply entwined in it now. Her earlier curiosity had turned into something sharper, more urgent. She needed to know the truth, not just for her own understanding, but because it felt like the resolution of this conflict would matter to everyone on board. The man's eyes darted toward the front of the plane, as though considering an escape that didn't exist. His breathing quickened, and his voice dropped to a frantic whisper. "You don't know what you're risking by doing this. There are bigger things at play." Alan leaned back slightly, his expression unchanging. "There's always something bigger at play, but that doesn't excuse what you've done." Maya's pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to process the weight of their words. The stakes were higher than she'd realized, the conflict deeper and more dangerous than a simple clash of egos. Whatever was unfolding here had the power to change everything, not just for the man beside her, but for everyone in the cabin. And as the tension reached its breaking point, Maya knew that the most intense moments was still to come. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as the tension between Alan and the man seated beside Maya reached its breaking point. The air felt heavier, as though everyone aboard could sense that something significant was about to happen. Maya shifted in her seat, torn between watching the silent exchange and trying to piece together the puzzle that had slowly unraveled over the course of the flight. Alan's unwavering calm contrasted starkly with the man's visible panic, a clash of energy that drew everyone's attention like a magnet. Finally, the man broke the silence, his voice strained and defensive. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "You don't have the authority to accuse me of anything." Alan's gaze remained steady. "Authority isn't the issue. Accountability is." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, It seemed like he might lash out. Instead, he sank further into his seat, his composure crumbling like a facade worn too thin. Maya's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, knowing that the moment of truth was imminent. Alan turned slightly, addressing the cabin in a voice that carried a quiet power. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I apologize for the disruption, but I feel it's important to address something that affects all of us." Passengers exchanged curious glances, their murmurs fading into silence as Alan continued. "The man seated here is Martin Hensley," he said, gesturing toward the man beside Maya. "He's been under investigation for embezzling funds from organizations dedicated to providing aid to marginalized communities." Maya's breath caught in her throat. The revelation was shocking, but it also explained so much. The man's hostility, his nervous glances at Alan, his palpable fear throughout the flight. He wasn't just avoiding Alan's judgment, he was running from the consequences of his actions. Martin's face turned ashen, and he shook his head vehemently. "This is a lie," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have no proof." Alan's expression didn't waver. "The proof is already in the hands of the authorities, and I suspect the ground team you saw earlier was informing me of the same." A ripple of shock spread through the cabin, the passengers whispering among themselves. Maya felt a surge of emotions, anger, disbelief, but also a deep sense of satisfaction. The man who had humiliated her earlier was now exposed for what he truly was. It wasn't just about karma, it was about justice. Martin's composure shattered completely. He stood abruptly, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. The system is broken. I was just trying to survive." Alan's voice remained calm but firm. "Survival doesn't justify stealing from those who need it most. You had choices, Martin. You just didn't make the right ones." The confrontation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of two uniformed air marshals who had quietly moved down the aisle while Alan was speaking. "Mr. Hensley," one of them said, his tone authoritative, "please remain seated. We'll need to speak with you when we land." Martin froze, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. Slowly, he sank back into his seat, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. As the marshals took their positions nearby, the cabin slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Maya turned to Alan, her voice soft but resolute. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying more weight than she expected, "for standing up for what's right." Alan smiled faintly. "It's what we owe each other. A better world starts with accountability." The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, the earlier tension giving way to a quiet sense of resolution. Maya found herself reflecting on everything that had happened, from Martin's initial arrogance to his ultimate unmasking. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was bigger than any single confrontation. It was a reminder of the importance of integrity, even when no one is watching. As the plane began its descent, a final twist came. One of the flight attendants approached Maya with a slip of paper. "Mr. Sinclair asked me to give this to you," she said with a warm smile before walking away. Maya unfolded the note, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words. "Asterisk, your work inspires me. Let's collaborate soon. Alan asterisk." She looked back at Alan, who met her gaze with a knowing nod. In that moment, Maya realized that this flight had changed more than just the course of Martin's life. It had opened a new chapter in her own. And as the plane touched down, she felt ready to take on whatever came next. As the plane touched down, there was a collective exhale among the passengers, a release of tension that had been building throughout the journey. Maya felt her shoulders relax as she gazed out the window at the sprawling airport. The confrontation with Martin Hensley had left the cabin in a quiet but reflective mood. Whispers still lingered, passengers recounting the dramatic turn of events, but there was also a shared understanding that something important had transpired. The air marshals stood near the exit, waiting to escort Martin off the plane. He remained in his seat, his head bowed, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. Maya couldn't help but wonder what his story would be after this. Despite everything he'd done, there was a sadness in his demeanor that hinted at regret, or perhaps fear of the consequences that awaited him. But whatever his reasons had been, the damage he caused couldn't be undone. Justice had to take its course. As the passengers began disembarking, Alan Sinclair stood and reached for his briefcase. Before he left, he paused next to Maya's row. "It's been a pleasure meeting you, Maya," he said with a warm smile. "I meant what I wrote. Let's talk soon." Maya smiled back, feeling a surge of gratitude and excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. I'll look forward to it." He nodded and exited the plane, his calm presence leaving a lasting impression. Maya watched him go, marveling at how his composed demeanor had diffused a potentially explosive situation. Alan Sinclair wasn't just a renowned philanthropist. He was someone who truly embodied the values he stood for, and now he was offering her a chance to collaborate. It felt surreal, but also like a validation of the work she had poured her heart into. As she gathered her belongings and made her way off the plane, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with Martin, though unsettling, had reinforced the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. The humiliation she had endured earlier no longer weighed on her. Instead, it felt like a turning point, a moment that proved resilience and integrity always win out in the end. The terminal was bustling with activity, but Maya barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by everything that had transpired during the flight. She replayed the key moments in her mind, from Martin's initial arrogance to his unraveling, and how Alan's quiet strength had shifted the dynamic entirely. It was a stark reminder that power doesn't always come from loud words or dominating presence. It can come from calm conviction and a deep sense of right and wrong. Before leaving the airport, Maya received a notification on her phone. It was an email from Alan's assistant, following up on their brief conversation. The subject line read, "Next steps for collaboration *." Maya couldn't suppress the smile that spread across her face as she opened the email. It outlined an invitation to a panel discussion at the summit, where Alan wanted her to share her expertise on community development programs. The opportunity was more than she could have imagined, and she felt both honored and humbled. Outside the terminal, the crisp evening air greeted her, carrying with it a sense of clarity. As she waited for her ride, she reflected on how one unexpected encounter had changed the trajectory of her day, and perhaps her career. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, but Maya was reminded that even in moments of adversity, there's an opportunity to rise above and grow stronger. In the days that followed, news of Martin Hensley's arrest made headlines. Details of his embezzlement scandal emerged, revealing the extent of the harm he had caused to charitable organizations and the communities they served. Maya couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for those affected by his actions, but she also felt a renewed determination to continue her work. If anything, the experience underscored the importance of holding those in power accountable and ensuring that resources meant to uplift others were used responsibly. The summit came quickly, and Maya arrived feeling both nervous and excited. The venue buzzed with energy, filled with leaders, activists, and changemakers from around the world. Alan Sinclair was already there, greeting attendees with his characteristic warmth and humility. When he spotted Maya, he walked over and greeted her like an old friend. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, his tone sincere. "Thank you for inviting me," Maya replied. "It's an honor to be here." The panel discussion was a success, with Maya sharing insights from her work and connecting with other like-minded individuals. She left the stage feeling more inspired than ever, knowing that her voice had made an impact. Alan approached her afterward, congratulating her on her presentation. "You have a gift," he said simply. "The world needs more people like you." The words stayed with her long after the summit ended. They reminded her that even in moments of doubt, even when faced with hostility or challenges, staying true to her values would always lead her in the right direction. Months later, Maya found herself reflecting on that fateful flight as she stood in front of a classroom filled with young students in an underserved community. The programs she had worked so hard to develop were finally taking root, and the smiles on the children's faces were a testament to the power of perseverance and hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. As she wrapped up her lesson and packed up her materials, she thought back to the note Alan had given her on the plane. Your work inspires me. Those 4 words had ignited a spark that continued to drive her forward. And as she walked out of the classroom into the bright sunlight, she carried with her the belief that even the smallest actions could create ripples of change. In the days that followed, the department was thrown into turmoil. Mark's recording of Randall Hart became the cornerstone of a sprawling investigation. It wasn't just the precinct involved. Hart's network extended to other departments, local officials, and even a few high-ranking individuals Mark had admired. It was a shocking revelation that sent ripples through the community and left Mark grappling with a sense of betrayal he couldn't shake. Evelyn worked tirelessly, coordinating with the district attorney's office and ensuring the investigation stayed focused. Her leadership during the crisis was steady and decisive, and even those who had doubted her began to see the depth of her commitment to justice. Mark couldn't deny the respect he had developed for her, though Hart's cryptic warning lingered in the back of his mind. The arrest of Hart and several officers from the precinct came swiftly. The media frenzy that followed painted the department in a harsh light, but Evelyn faced the cameras with a calm resolve. She spoke about accountability, about rebuilding trust, and about the courage of those who had come forward to expose the truth. Her words struck a chord, and while the damage to the department's reputation was significant, the community began to see her as a symbol of hope. Mark, however, wasn't ready to celebrate. While he felt relief that justice was being served, he couldn't ignore the lingering doubts Hart had sown. The idea that Evelyn might have secrets of her own weighed heavily on him. He tried to push it aside, to focus on his role in helping the department recover, but the thought wouldn't leave him. One afternoon, as Evelyn was packing up for the day, Mark decided to confront her. He approached her office, his heart pounding as he knocked on the door. She looked up, surprised but welcoming. "Mark," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, unsure how to begin. Finally, he said, "There's something I need to ask you. It's about what Hart said." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but Mark noticed the subtle tension in her posture. "What did he say?" Mark leaned forward, his voice low. "He implied that you have your own secrets, that you might not be as clean as you seem." For a moment, Evelyn didn't respond. Then she let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. "I wondered if you'd bring this up," she said. "I knew Hart would try to twist things, even in his final moments." Mark's pulse quickened. "So, is there something I should know?" Evelyn looked him in the eye, her gaze steady. "There's nothing in my past or present that compromises my integrity or this investigation. But I'll be honest with you, Mark. No one in this line of work is completely without flaws. I've made mistakes, like anyone else. The question is whether those mistakes define me, or whether I've learned from them." Mark studied her, searching for any sign of deception. He didn't see any. Still, the doubt gnawed at him. "I want to believe you," he said. "But after everything that's happened, it's hard to trust." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "I understand. Trust isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. All I can do is continue to show you, through my actions, that I'm committed to the same principles I've asked of you and this department." Her words struck a chord with Mark. He realized that, despite everything, Evelyn had consistently acted with integrity. Whatever mistakes she had made in the past, she seemed determined to do the right thing now. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough for him to take the next step forward. In the weeks that followed, the department began the slow process of rebuilding. Evelyn implemented new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Community forums became a regular occurrence, providing a space for ongoing dialogue between residents and officers. Training programs were overhauled, focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. It wasn't an easy transition. There were still moments of tension, pushback from within the department, and skepticism from the community. But progress was being made, one step at a time. Mark found himself at the center of this transformation. His experience during the investigation had given him a new perspective on his role as an officer. He began taking a more active part in the community forums, listening to residents' concerns and sharing his own journey of growth. It wasn't always comfortable, but it felt necessary. One evening, after a particularly impactful forum, Mark stood outside the community center, watching the sunset. Evelyn joined him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Mark," she said. He smiled faintly. "I had a lot to learn. Still do." She nodded. "We all do. But what matters is that you're willing to keep learning." As the sky darkened, Mark felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The journey had been painful and messy, but it had also been transformative. He wasn't the same person he had been when Evelyn first walked into the precinct, and neither was the department. As they parted ways, Mark realized that the story wasn't just about uncovering corruption or rebuilding trust. It was about resilience, accountability, and the power of change, both within institutions and individuals. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, he felt ready to face it, knowing he wasn't alone in the effort to make things better.